Three, two, one, and I think we are now live on Facebook. Good morning, everybody. Good evening to Professor Iyer, who is joining us from the US. Uh, Today, we are going to talk about a very special topic, that is the dancing women, choreographing corporeal histories of Hindi cinema. That is also the title of Professor Usha Iyer's recent book. Professor Iyer's research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of cinema, performance, gender and sexuality studies, with a specific focus on film and performance histories, body cultures, and global South Asian and South cultural traffic along the vectors of race, gender, caste, and religion. Professor Iyer is the author of Dancing Woman, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema, that was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press, and hopefully the Indian edition of that book will be out soon, in which she examines construction of gender, stardom, sexuality, and spectacle in Hindi cinema through women's labor, collaborative networks, and gestural genealogies to produce a corporeal history of the South Asian cultural modernities. Through a material history of the labor of producing on-screen dance, theoretical framework that emphasize collaboration, aesthetic approaches to embodiment, and formal analysis of cine-choreographic techno-spectacles, Dancing Woman offers a variegated, textured history of cinema, dance, and music. And I think some part of it will be touched upon in this lecture as well. Professor Usha is of affiliate faculty at Stanford's Center for South Asia and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She is currently a fellow at the Oxford Humanities Center and a 2020 CCSRE faculty fellow. He was also a fellow at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research in 2018 to 2019. So without further ado, I am really pleased to invite Professor Usha Iyer to deliver today's Caravan lecture. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and to the entire team at Carvan for this very kind invitation. I'm so delighted to speak with you and delighted to hear of all the great work that you're doing. And I hope to hear from many of you who might be watching this in the Q&A section that will follow the talk. I will share my screen so I can share the PowerPoint. I must warn you that the videos might get a little choppy, but that's really just how Zoom works. So I want you to know in advance, it's not the reception, it's not the Wi-Fi, it's actually just how videos work on Zoom. And I also wanted to clarify that I'm a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center this year. Okay, let me get started. What I will do today is kind of lay some of the broad outlines of what the book aims to do, and then pick up sections from a particular chapter on the 1950s and the 60s, so you get a sense of the aims of the book. Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema is a study of the material and cultural production of film dance in relation to the construction of cinematic narratives, performing bodies, and spectator citizens. The book specifically undertakes an examination of film dance and female performance in popular Hindi cinema from the 1930s to the 1990s to explore how the dynamic figurations of the body wrought by dance and by particularly cinematic dance forms produce unique constructions of gender, sexuality, stardom, and spectacle. Why women? Quite simply because they were the primary performers of dance in Hindi cinema until the late 1990s. And many of you might be familiar with the figures you see on screen, some of them, and some of them you may not. We'll briefly talk about Sadhna Bose and Azuri, for example, who are in that top series of photographs up on the slide there. A focus on the routine picturization of solo dance numbers with female performers reveals how gender plays a central role in the discourses of censorship and spectacle that animate film dance. The attempted but routinely foiled regulation of dance practices and movement vocabularies reveals desires and anxieties around women's visibility, mobility, and participation in the public sphere. To start off, let us consider very briefly the early history of dance on film. As forms invested in the exploration and exhibition of movement, cinema and dance have had a long history of engagement. Cinema enlisted dance from its very beginnings. In films like the Dixon experimental sound film and Annabelle the Dancer that you see on screen here, the Edison Manufacturing Company used dancers to demonstrate to first time spectators cinema's propensity for the spectacular display of movement. Dance, along with acrobatics and other forms of physical display, was employed to showcase the immense kinetic potential of the new medium of film. Laurent Guido, a French theorist of movement in early cinema, remarks, dance, just as sports and gymnastics, imposed itself at the beginning of the 20th century as a harmonious way of organizing body movement. It was considered that the muscular mimicry put into motion by physical performance would position film spectators under an irresistible rhythmic spell. End quote. That's Laurent Guido's quote. In India as well, from the introduction of film technology in the early 1900s, there is a similar interest in capturing dance on celluloid. And you'll see here some images and a GIF from two 1919 films, D.G. Falke's Kalyamardan and the recently found Bilva Mangal. By the time we get to the late silent film Diler Jigar or Gallant Hearts, one of the few surviving pre-sound Indian films, we notice a movement away from the earlier frontal tableau presentation as multiple dynamization techniques are employed to present the heroine Saranga, you see her up on screen, her dance performance. Despite the absence of sound, we get a sense of rhythm from Saranga's movements, the playing of the tambourine and the drum, and the frequent intercutting between shots at varying camera distance. So unlike just the static camera of earlier films, by this 1931 film, we see there's much more mobilization of cinematic technology and bodies on screen in this late silent film. Gallant Hearts adds dance to the film's swashbuckling action to generate a hectic spectacle of attractions that would come to define what we know as the masala film form of popular Hindi cinema. Masala referring, as many of you would know, to a spice mix, and in the case of popular Indian cinema, the routine combination within any film and genre of melodrama, romance, song and dance sequences, and fight and comedy sequences. So this is an early example of that. Over the following decades, Hindi film dance eclectically borrows from various classical and folk dance forms in the Indian subcontinent and beyond, and also adopts freely the vocabularies of transnational forms such as cha-cha-cha, belly dance, salsa, swing, etc. The adroit and hectic heterogeneity of Hindi film dance makes it a profoundly modern dance form, countering accounts of the absence of modern dance in India. Popular film dance is, in fact, a vital space of experimentation where different gestural systems are mixed through what I consider a mongrel logic to produce choreographies of great affective force. A lot of the Hindi film song and dance numbers, a lot of the study of Hindi film song and dance numbers has focused on music, on art direction, on the mise en scène, where these song sequences are set, the relationship of the musical number to the narrative, and has treated the song and dance sequence as a combined entity rather than studying dance separately. My book's focus on the display and mobilization of the dancing body proposes new models for theorizing the Hindi film song and dance sequence. It advances questions asked less often of the song and dance composite form, such as how do dancer actors impact the cinematic narratives and the music composed for them? What is the difference in our spectatorial engagement with dance numbers versus only sung performances? You see the actress Nutan here below singing a song, and you see Vaijanti Mala, the well-known dancing actress, the dancer heroine, dancing, but the same playback singer Lata Mangeshkar singing for both of them. How is the on-screen mobility and stardom of the dancer actress constructed differently than that of actresses not renowned for their dancing skills? These inquiries are generative of new frameworks for analyzing labor, production economies, cultural memory of the cinema, and taste hierarchies. I wasn't interested, for instance, in providing an account of quote unquote the great dancers of Hindi cinema, though many of the celebrated dancers do feature in the book. Rather, the book aims to understand how dancer actresses and other film dance workers participate in and produce major shifts in the film industry. How on-screen dance negotiates social changes, including in the participation of women in the public sphere and the relationship between dance and film technology. Another major driving question in the book is the pleasure we experience in watching dance numbers. Why they make our hair stand on end, our fingers snap, our toes tap, and equally the joy and pride of performers and other film personnel in their work. This leads in the book to a foregrounding of collaborative experimentation and creativity, which is often erased when we tell a story of cinema only through particular directors and stars. You see here, for instance, the famed choreographer Saroj Khan directing a song and dance number, directing the star Madhuri Dixit, and the director of the film Chimpu Kapoor, who passed away just very recently, is on the set, but it's really focused on Saroj Khan during the kind of direction of the dance number. Through a focus on genealogical and professional histories, training, and labor, the book produces a different kind of narrative about female labor in the Bombay film industry, one that centers experimentation, collaboration, and virtuosity, the training, their pride, and their joy in their work in the careers of Hindi cinema's dancing women. A material history of the labor of producing on-screen dance demonstrates how dancing women of various caste, race, religious, and class configurations co-choreograph the dancescape of Bombay cinema. They collaborate together, they choreograph these films, these narratives together. A collaborative network captures the complex intermedial corporeal history of film dance production. By intermedial, I mean they're also dancing on stage. They're sometimes classical dance trained heroines. So they're dancing on stage and they're performing in the cinema as well. And sometimes they're also musical artists. So they're performing in plays, they're performing across multiple media. This makes visible the bodies, this kind of co-choreographing, collaborative, corporeal history makes visible the bodies whose labor is rendered immaterial. The labor of these ghost or shadow figures is central to the production of the dancing star, but is often pushed to the background, throwing a long, dark shadow on the spotlighted histories of acclaimed film stars. Who are some of these ghost figures? Ghost figures marginalized at various historical junctures include traditional performers such as tawaiffs or courtesans and devdasis, who were temple, court, and salon dancers. The cinematic vamp, you see an early example here, the black and white picture of Azuri. The behind the scenes choreographer, we just saw an image of Saroj Khan, for instance, and numerous nameless background dancers or backup dancers. The book's historical attention to these various dancing figures over the 19th and 20th centuries made it apparent that one could not tell the story of the dancing heroine without invoking all these other dancing women. Consider, for instance, the Anglo-Indian backup dancer Philomena Leon's legs replacing the star Madhubala's legs in some films. Or how in Pakiza, the 1972 film, in the final dance number of Pakiza, the star Meena Kumari's footwork on broken glass was actually performed by her dancing double Padma Khanna. In these instances, the figure of the on-screen dancing woman quite literally folds in the limbs, torsos, and gestures of various and variously coded dancing bodies. When we trace material industrial practices and logics, we begin to formulate a corporeal history that is peopled by many bodies with agency and authorship dispersed over numerous acknowledged and invisibilized actors, including, for instance, here, backup dancers, people whose bodies were used as body doubles. To illustrate some of these questions that undergird the book's approach, and if you're not familiar with some of these dance numbers, let's watch a spectacular sequence. We'll watch a short clip of a sequence from the 1969 film Prince. Bombay cinema's three best-known dancer actors of that time, the Bharatanatyam The Bharatanatyam trained heroine Vaijanti Mala. Bharatanatyam, and I use the kind of the term classical in a very measured way throughout the book, and we can discuss that later if we like. And it might come up in the presentation today, because by the time she's getting trained in Bharatanatyam, it is being produced as a new classical dance form. The mixed race Helen, who routinely featured as a dancing vamp over 3 decades and to whom we will return again later, and the loose limbed Shami Kapoor, sometimes referred to as the Elvis Presley of India. This dance number staging of a techno spectacle of cine-choreographic innovations, dazzling costume and set design, and an array of musical and dance styles alerts us to questions of virtuosity, labor, and pleasure undergirding the production and reception of the popular Hindi film dance number. While the film's plot undertakes many contortions to stage this dance number, when we shift our focus from narrative to bodily performance, to the corporeal competence and protracted training required for dancing, and to the spectatorial desires that screen dancing bodies activate, we may discern that spectacle is the narrative when dancing stars like these come together on screen. Dance scholar Jane Desmond describes the dancing body as, quote, a ground for the inscription of meaning, a tool for its enactment, and a medium for its continual creation and recreation, end quote. We may read Vaijantimala, Shami Kapoor, and Helen's bodies as writing and written upon. These are materializations of biology, history, and technology. Helen's supple, twisting torso, mobile mouth, and splayed legs, Vaijantimala's large, coal-lined eyes, straight-backed stance, and the crisp mudras or codified gestures of her Bharatanatyam-trained body, and Shami Kapoor's seemingly unchoreographed movements disclose the accumulated somatic or bodily experiences of each performer, disciplined into certain styles of comportment that have sedimented layers of gestures in each body. The French theorist Henri Lefebvre says gestural systems embody ideology and bind it to practice. Through gestures, ideology escapes from pure abstraction and performs actions. End quote. Helen's cabaret and Vaijantimala's quote unquote classical dance routines bear the traces of long histories of the performing arts and of gendered performativity in the Indian subcontinent. They fold in figurations of hybrid Oriental quote unquote dances from the 1930s, the Anglo Indian dancing girl in Bombay cinema, and the newly anointed classical dancer who emerges in the 1940s and 50s through a concerted marginalization of hereditary performers such as Devadasis and Tawayevs. And I spend a good part of one chapter in the book discussing exactly these moves. Each performer in this dance number mobilizes thus a gestural history, not just of their own star bodies, but also of popular Hindi cinema's borrowings from other performance traditions and cinematic idioms. Attending to Vaijantimala's fingers and feet, Helen's waist, and Shami Kapoor's tremulous head, as indeed the choreography, cinematography, and editing pointedly invite us to, provides a means of constructing a historiography of popular cultural forms and trans-regional exchanges through the dancing body. Analyzing the collision and coalescence of cultural forms in the bodies of dancer actors illuminates how the planes of the popular and the classical, the regional, the national, and the global are negotiated and articulated by Hindi film dance. In addition to the social practices that construct bodies, the training that they go through, the kinds of meanings that are placed upon their bodies as traditional, modern, Western, Indian, etc., dance forces us to attend to the corporeal materiality of performing bodies. The dancer actress is employed here as an analytical category. She acts as a nexus for relations between industry, narrative, the film's narrative, and spectatorship. But she is also a material artifact composed of limbs, flesh, bone, and skin. The neuromusculature of the dancing body draws our gaze to both anatomical surface and ideological depth, or indeed the reverse, to the depth of the performing body beneath its ideological inscriptions, as, for instance, chaste, salacious, traditional, modern, heroine, vamp, etc. The dance film scholar Adrian McLean asks, quote, which parts of the body are allowed to speak and perform, and in what contexts? Which parts of the body repeat the discursive meaning already placed upon bodies by culture? What kinds of physical training and competence produce what effects? End quote. The dance-off in popular Hindi cinema has typically been read as corporealizing the post-colonial conflict of modernity and tradition through its binary of Western and state-sanctioned Indian dance styles. And I discuss in the book the Indian state's project of classifying and canonizing only particular dance forms as classical and folk in the 1950s. However, by placing Vaijanti Mala's quote unquote Indian and Helen's Western dancing bodies next to rather than in opposition to each other, by showing us their delight in each other's performance, and by sharing performance space and time equally between the heroine, vamp, and hero, this dance number moves away from tired tradition modernity cliches, presenting instead a radical celebration of the performative repertoire of each of these dancing bodies. It also enables a reading of the hybridity of both its Indian and Western dance forms. The three performers' routines all mix various styles, with gestures in turn to the continuous processes of corporeal figurations through the colonial and the post-colonial periods, rather than presenting them as discrete and bound by rigid discourses of authenticity, so that we're not involved in discussing whether this is authentic Bharatanatyam or Kathakali or tap dance among their routines, but all of them turn out to be hybrid, in fact. A focus on the materiality of dancing bodies draws our attention as well to the spaces between bodies and to the shifting registers of agency and desire articulated by film dance and its female practitioners. Countering industrial and class hierarchies between the A-list heroine and the lower rung vamp, Vaijantimala is reported to have been icy towards the hero Shami Kapoor on set, but warmly remarks about Helen in her memoir. Quote, Helen is one person with whom I really got along in the industry, as we were both equally reticent, no talking, just working on the sets, says Vaijantimala. This account of the bond between the hardworking dancer actresses prompts us to consider flows and linkages between performing bodies and to revise our assumptions about relations between the supposedly taciturn and quote unquote traditional heroine, the immodest westernized vamp, and the flamboyant hero. The three dancing stars, each a particular assemblage of gestures and intensities, are, by the time of the production of this number, mature performers at the height of their dancing powers. But the affective force of the dance number is produced not only by the on screen dancing body. I advance the concept of a multi-bodied choreo-musicking body, which is a composite of on-screen dancers as well as off-screen choreographers, playback singers, musicians, directors, cinematographers, editors, set and costume designers, focus pullers, carpenters, among many other personnel. Shifting attention from the ideological work performed by the song and dance sequence, which has dominated the study of the Hollywood musical and of popular Hindi cinema, to studying the industrial practices, training, rehearsal, and personnel required for these attractions produces a different history and theorization of labor, materiality, and the economies of production. In the on-screen dance number, we do not see the markings on the floor for camera and dancer placement, the sweating under the studio lights, the time taken for costume changes. However, close attention to the production of film dance spectacle prompts an exploration of the interfaces of bodies, surfaces, spaces, and temporalities, which in turn drives an examination of popular Hindi cinema's figurations through its affects, its materialities, and strategies for evoking spectatorial desire and pleasure. Vaijantimala notes of the song sequence that we just watched a clip of, Mukabla Humse Na Karo. She says, it clicked so well that it made your toes curl. highlighting our intense somatic, our physical, corporeal engagement with Hindi cinema's dance numbers, which produce an embodied and kinesthetic spectatorship. The dance number's aesthetic of excess accords with the promise of all popular cinemas to exceed the limitations of the mundane and the quotidian, enacting, as Erin Brannigan notes, the human potential for physical virtuosity and play. With this excess somatic energy producing spectatorial responses in us, such as goosebumps, tapping feet, snapping fingers, etc., that are located centrally in our bodies. The dance off between, and it's typically between two dancing women, right up to the recent, the Sanjay Leela Bhansali Devdas with its song Dola Re Dola. And there are multiple such dance offs between dancing women. The dance off operates as a primary site for the bonding of dancing women, as their intensely trained bodies join in an exaltation of their singular capacities for movement. Without erasing the unequal financial and representational hierarchies into which each performer was slotted along axes of caste, race, and class privilege, and to which I pay close attention in the book, what is common to Helen and Vaijantimala is that their primary identification as dancers required the Hindi film narrative and the Bombay film industry to make space for their dancing bodies. These were typically coded antipodally, Helen as Western and modern, Vaijantimala as Indian and traditional. But watching them dance together activates an alternate vision of Bombay cinema's logics and economies of production, one considerably driven by moving dancing women. I'll move now to a second section, which again draws on the 1950s and 60s. I turn now to another kind of folding between the categories of dancing and acting that prompts us to think about aesthetic and theoretical questions around the construction of the dancing body in popular Hindi cinema. In examining the role of dance in the production of the stardom of dancer actresses of this period, like Vaijantimala and Wahida Rahman, I encountered the routine binarization of the categories of acting and dancing, with more somber, static, seemingly inward looking performers hailed as proper thespians, as good actors, and more mobile, seemingly outward directed, dance trained performers disparaged as mannered or theatrical. Through a focus on the dancer actress Vaijantimala, this section proposes larger critical consequences for theorizations of acting when we read dancing and acting alongside rather than against each other. And we reconfigure in the process standards for acting that are predominantly founded on rubrics of psychological realism, transparency, and face centered emoting. Let's turn to look at Vaijantimala and discussions of her acting. Vaijantimala had, through the early 1950s, acted in dance centric films, which earned her a reputation as mainly a dancer with meager acting abilities. In her memoir, she reminisces, quote, "Till Devdas happened," this is the 1955 Devdas by Bimal Roy, "till Devdas happened, the critics kept harping that I was a dancer, not an actress. But after its release, I received terrific reviews," end quote. She ascribes this metamorphosis, what she calls a metamorphosis from a dancer to an emoting actress, to the famed auteur Bimal Roy's ability to discern the quote bhavas or moods that flit across a dancer's face during those myriad mudras or gestures, end quote. Rather than replicate this division between dancing and acting, moving and emoting, I suggest here that when we shift the dominant focus from realist, speech driven, face centric emoting, when we take seriously performance that is located not only in the face, that most celebrated expressive field for evaluating good acting, but located across the body in dancing legs, gesturing fingers, gyrating torsos, emoting necks and heads, we are able to locate the density and fluidity of performance in movement and gesture. We sensitize our evaluative criteria to the performing body's ability to produce and express meaning through movement. Dance scholar Sally Ness asserts, When I think of dancers, I think of their bodies. When we turn to dance to theorize film acting, we may similarly proclaim, when I think of actors, I think of their bodies. In the final minutes of Katputli, a 1957 Hindi film about an impoverished girl groomed into a successful theater actress, Pushpa, the female protagonist, takes to the stage, heartbroken because her insecure husband has taken away her infant daughter and accused her of being in a relationship with her director mentor. You see some of the scenes over here. When Vaijantimala stars as Pushpa, it is no surprise that the film's climax is articulated through an elaborate dance number. The dancer actress expertly shifts from a melodramatic realist register of performance through tears. First, she appears on stage, she weeps, you can see the tears streaming down her face, she gives a speech, but then she switches to a non realist epic dimension that is wrought through dance. And I'll play the clip of this final dance number from Kathakali. Employing the vocabulary of the South Indian dance form Kathakali, traditionally performed by men, Vaijantimala's strong swivels and grounded leaps testify to impressive strength and virtuosity and generate variously the rasas or the affects of Raudra, anger, Veera, courage, Bhayanaka, terror, and Karuna, pathos. The movement vocabulary of Kathakali, with its heavy and muscular footwork, large expansive movements of the limbs that allow the dancer to forcefully annex space, a fixed, strong torso, and dramatic pulsating eye movements, enables Pushpa to eloquently express her agony and rage at the injustice meted to her. As Pushpa spins in anguish and resentment, the camera too comes off its axis and sways in canted angles to the music as if it has all become too much to bear, until she collapses onto the floor to rousing applause from the audience. All that the film can do after this dizzyingly virtuosic climax is tag on a few minutes of hasty and feeble narrative closure that reconciles Pushpa with her husband. It is the danced finale that effects a complex, multi layered staging of the melodrama of female suffering under a patriarchal regime that limits women's movement, whether in terms of bodily comportment or moving out of the space of domesticity, which in this case dancing enables her to do. This construction of the affective architecture of a film through dance helps explain why dancer actresses, including many other film actors like Sadhna Bose, who you see on screen here, Wahida Rehman, Padmini, Madhuri Dixit, Sri Devi, among many others, they have a different performative repertoire than actors who do not dance or who are not trained in dance. This opens up the assessment of acting beyond the criteria of naturalism and realism, which have been employed by many film critics, to entirely different approaches to acting and embodying characters and their emotions. Indeed, dancer actresses who train to produce fully expressive bodies reveal the corporeal foundations of film acting. In her detailed account of training practices in Indian classical dance, Ananya Chatterjee notes, quote, the Indian dancer never learns to think in terms of muscularity, weight shift, energy manipulation, or finding his or her center, but instead imbibes these principles through, she uses terms from medieval treatises, through Angasuddhi, purity of limb, and Saustubha, purity of body line, among many other principles, as delineated in performance treatises like the Natya Shastra and the Abhinaya Darpana. Without erasing the complicated history of this textual tradition or essentializing older performative traditions, one may find ways to engage with them for their potential to reveal certain cultural and social attitudes towards performance, especially when we read these texts' body centered aesthetics translated through the evolving embodied knowledges of Devadasis, Tavayevs, dancer actresses, choreographers, backup dancers, reality TV show participants, and the like. So it's not a kind of pure classical tradition, which in fact is an artificially produced category in the early 20th century. But that many of them were trained in exactly these kinds of texts and were bringing that training to the film industry as well. You see here, for example, a quote from the Abhinaya Darpana, where it charts the course of the dance, the Natya Krama. The song should be sustained in the throat. Its meaning must be shown by the hands. The mood or the bhava must be shown by the glances. Rhythm, sorry, or tala is marked by the feet. For wherever the hand moves, there the glances follow. Where the glances go, the mind follows. Where the mind goes, the mood follows. Where the mood goes, there is the flavor or the rasa. And this is the kind of language that dance trained actresses often use within the Hindi film industry, used to discuss their own acting and how they came to perform in films. The delineation in these Indian aesthetic treatises of the production of affect through a series of physical actions provides clues to the corporeally grounded conventions of performance and reception that inform dance trained actors in Indian cinema, however tangentially. When dancer actors bring to film these conventions from codified styles of dance, they deeply alter the melodramatic realist mode of acting in popular film, and indeed the very structuring of the film's narrative content. Vaijantimala, trained in a recently textualized Bharatanatyam in the 1940s, marshals the language of this dance training in describing her own experience with film acting. Quote, I never had any training in theater. Dance has been the most crucial component in my evolving as an actress. Dancing is so much of bhava or mood and abhinaya, expression of emotion, she says. Her contemporary, Wahida Rehman, ascribes her famed emotive abilities to her training in Bharatanatyam. Recalling the director Guru Dutt's comment, quote, she did the song in Pyasa well because she is a dancer. She knows how to give silent expressions, end quote. Borrowing from these treatises' elaborate lexicon of the movements of major, minor, and subsidiary limbs, ranging across, in some instances, 80 face movements, 36 kinds of glances, detailed articulations of armpits, shoulder blades, calves, eyelids, nostrils, lower lip, chin, teeth, etc., I deconstruct the dancing female body into three broad categories: the face, the torso, and the limbs. Each of these body zones is capable of a variety of addresses, depending on the deployment of their constituent parts and the social connotations of those gestural articulations at certain historical moments. So the same body zones don't mean the same things in different periods, right? The body also accretes and collects different meanings during different periods in Hindi cinema. Additionally, the gestural systems of many Indian dance forms enable the dancer to assume different roles so that a whole range of experiences may be expressed through gestures. Describing the renowned Odissi dancer Kelucharan Mohapatra's enactment of the role of Krishna through gestures of flute playing And then his impersonation of Radha through gestural descriptions of her breasts. Uttara Asha Kurlawala notes, quote, the same single performer represents empowerment and seduction, religion and sensuality, theatrical artifice and human emotions, male and female, dominant and subordinate positions, end quote. Actors trained in dance fundamentally alter the representational logics of popular Hindi cinema by bringing to it this multiplication of personas through their ability to gesturally embody manifold singularities. In each of her dance films in the 1950s, Vaijanti Mala plays multiple dancing roles, often dressed in drag to play both male and female parts, Radha and Krishna, a peacock and a village girl, a Manipuri and Bharatanatyam and Kathak dancer, all in the same number. These instances of dancing masquerade not only put on display Vaijantimala's skill and versatility, but they also evacuate the dance numbers of male presence, producing radically altered figurations of female protagonists in her films, as women who do not necessarily sing and dance to convey emotions centered around heterosexual romance, but as trained professional dancers flaunting their magnificent artistry. Significantly, in later quote unquote serious films, where she wins accolades for her acting abilities, Vaijantimala's her control as an author, her authorial control over the narrative is diminished. As her performative repertoire is subsumed and domesticated into the conventional trajectory of male centered narratives. You see images here from Devadas of the 1955 and Sadhana, a 1957 film. Um, she's never quite as luminously in charge once she transitions from the dance films of the 1950s to the register of the social melodrama, where the ecstatic excess of her dancing body is circumscribed by more integrated narratives which are driven by the hero's goals. Theorizing acting through dancing illuminates thus how certain movement vocabularies engender specific types of cinematic narratives, genres, and industries, and centrally establishes the intermedial relationships of cinema with other performing traditions, with training in music, in dance, in martial arts, in a range in theater, for instance. When Vaijantimala employs Abhinaya to enact a range of human and non human subjectivities, rain, rivers, peacocks, snakes, thunder, lightning, flowers, gods and goddesses, and persecuted performing women like Pushpa in Katputli, her actor's body is imbued with the capacity to embody multi-scalar modalities, ranging from personal experiences to cosmic inhabitations. Even as narrative exigencies frame Pushpa as a puppet, which is what the title of the film is, Katputli, allegorizing female subjection in a realist melodramatic form. When this is articulated through dance, what erupts out of the narrative is Vaijantimala's dexterous choreography of multiple performance modes. In the body of a dancer actress, the puppet turns into the commanding puppet master. This is why, when we think of dancer actresses, there is no way to not think of their bodies, right? And that is the central argument for a corporeal history of dancing women. I'll turn briefly in the remaining time to another set of factors that inflect this folded figuration of the dancer actress in this period in the 50s and the 60s. While Vaijantimala was shrugged off as a South Indian dancing star for quite a few years in the Bombay film industry, the Tamil Muslim Wahida Rehman faced a contrasting situation of the erasure of her identity as a South Indian Bharatanatyam trained dancer. Both dancer actresses were trained by highly respected Nattuanars or gurus. Vahida Rehman trained under Tiruchendur Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, who initially refused to teach her because she was Muslim. She quotes him as saying, quote, she won't be able to express our varnams or musical compositions. How will she do abhinaya expressions? And adds, this is Vaida Rehman, she says, then he saw my horoscope and realized that I would be his last student, and so he accepted her. She recollects the enduring impact of her role as the noble prostitute Gulabo in her second Hindi film Pyasa from 1957. Quote, because Piazza was such a serious dramatic role, people thought of me only as an actress and not a dancer for a long time. And for a long time, I didn't get dancing roles, end quote. Indeed, not until the 1960s, well into her acting career, did Rahman play a dancer protagonist in films like Guide and Tisri Kasam. Many people didn't know that I'm a trained dancer because they felt I didn't behave like one, remarks Rahman in an interview, suggesting that the cultural iconicity of a Bharatanatyam dancer did not accommodate an actress of Muslim lineage who spoke Urdu and did not conform to the physical appearance of a Hindu goddess, the iconicity that Vaijantimala in turn was sedimented into. The corporeal and expressive requirements articulated by a newly Sanskritized Bharatanatyam and a Bombay film industry newly encountering South Indian actresses trained in Bharatanatyam generated these contestations and figurations of Vaijantimala as an accomplished dancer who needed to prove her acting abilities, and Vahida Rehman as a quote-unquote natural actress who did not fit the mold of a Bharatanatyam dancer. However, if we read Vahida Rehman's stardom through her production numbers, her dance numbers, rather than her justly celebrated acting, we produce a very different diagram of her performing body and her body of performance, as it were. In her debut at the age of 17 in the Telugu film Rojolu Marai, she features only as a dancer in the hit song that we'll watch a clip from here, Yeruva Kasagaru. Rehman describes the reception of this dance number. She says, in those days, audiences were known to throw coins at the screen to show their appreciation. And that's what people did when my dance started. We were told that when the film was over, people would ask the projectionist to run the song again, end quote. Like Vaijantimala, dance had led Rehman to the movies. Both stage and screen were no longer taboo for women like them. As Rehman remarked to me in a personal interview, discussing her transition from Bharatanatyam to hybrid film dance, quote, training in classical dance gives your body basic training and makes it so much easier to pick up other dances, she said. In her third and final film in the South in 1956, Rehman once again featured only in a dance number in the swashbuckling Oriental spectacular Ali Baba and 40 Thieves, the first full-length Tamil color film shot in Geva color. I won't play the song, I'll just leave this on screen. These Oriental spectaculars, often drawing from the Arabian Nights, served to showcase new technologies, including color stock, special effects, editing tricks, as well as the attraction of the Oriental dancing girl. Vaijantimala's dance numbers were also a key location for filmmakers to show off expensive film stock in the 1950s, including Geva color song and dance sequences in Nagin and Asha, Technicolor dance from Sadhna Bose in J.B.H. Wadia's 1941 dance film that you saw earlier, some images from, The Court Dancer, to Azuri, who you see here in V. Shantaram's 1935 film Chandrasena, to Vaijantimala in Nagin, to Helen in innumerable cabaret sets, especially constructed for her. The dancer actress is a pivotal figure in choreographing and fashioning new regimes of techno-spectacle. So it was the dancing body that actually occasioned experimenting with new technologies. Rehman's initial three films celebrating her versatility across what would be considered folk dance, Bharatanatyam, and Oriental dance prod us to imagine what her career might have looked like if she had stayed in the South, working in the Telugu and Tamil film industries that espoused different logics of cinematic spectacle. They remind us as well that the itinerant dancing girl and the heroine are never too far apart, and that dancer actresses take deep pleasure in presenting their skills on screen. Vijay Anand, director of the 1965 film Guide, remarks, quote, Wahida Rehman had a grace in her demeanor that only a dancer could have. But the world and she herself had forgotten that she was a dancer. I realized she needed the role of a dancer and hence Guide, end quote. And Rehman recalls that when Guide came her way, she said, it's okay if you can chop my dialogues, but don't cut my dance sequences. What is evident here is Rahman's desire to reclaim her dancing past, one obscured by an intervening decade of social melodramas that featured little to no dancing. What had been erased was the training of her body and her South Indian ancestry as she was molded into a leading Hindi Urdu actress. Her profound yearning to dance in Guide is mirrored in her character Rosie, pining to return to a life of dance. In the film, Rosie's mother, a Devadasi, keeps her away from a professional career in dance. On a trip with her husband, Rosie beseeches the tour guide Raju to take her to a snake charmer's colony where she says Nag Nritya or snake dance is performed. And I'll play a bit of the clip of the snake dance. These are images from Guide. Citing the snake dance as her favorite number in the film because it highlighted her dance skills, Vaida Rahman compares the labor involved in its production with the ease of featuring in other song sequences. For instance, Gata Rahe Mera Dil in the same film. She says, in a love song, the couple would usually just hold hands or run through fields, so no dance steps were required. End quote. On the other hand, the sweating and heavy breathing in the snake dance are revelatory of the labor expended by Rahman and the choreographing body. She recalls the strenuous rehearsals she went through. Quote, Hira Lal broke my bones. We rehearsed in a sound studio in Dadar between 5 and 8 in the morning. Then I'd come home, have a bath, and go to another studio to shoot some dialogue scenes. Straight from there, I went back to the dance rehearsal and we'd work till 10 or 11 in the night. My God, it killed me. I couldn't walk for days because all my muscles were aching so much. End quote. So this reveals how much more work she did on this dance number than in most of the scenes in the rest of the film. Rahman's dance partner, Sheila, was an assistant choreographer to Hira Lal, the choreographer of the film. Vijay Anand remarks that she was so supple and graceful that he told Rahman to watch her for inspiration. One can imagine how much labor Sheila must have expended on the snake dance, assisting Hiralal with the conceptualization of the dance, standing in for Rahman while she was away on other sets, rehearsing her own part in the dance, training backup dancers for the other opulent production dance numbers in the film, among many other tasks. Rahman recalls that Sheila was a very good and graceful dancer. Rahman says, I told her to become a solo dancer, but she had her own logic and said, I won't get many solo dances, but as an assistant, I can work on 10 pictures, end quote. In the same year of Guide's release in 1965, Sheila worked as an assistant choreographer and dancer on the considerably lower budget Tarzan Comes to Delhi. You can see here Dara Singh on the posters for this film, which, in keeping with the unabashed dance and action attractions of B movies, featured a multitude of dancing women. The careers of cine workers like Sheila makes apparent the many histories yet to be written about the dancing women in Hindi cinema across genres and production economies, not to mention the many off-screen bodies laboring to stage dance spectacle. In conclusion, then, in considering the gestural histories of Helen by Jantimala and Wahida Rahman, we are alerted to how central dance is in their negotiations of various identifications around caste, race, region, and religion. If we don't consider women and dancing and performing women specifically in our analyses of these categories, we fail to apprehend the complex processes involved in the social production of these categories through gendered practices of the body. When considered as a part of the history of performance traditions, cinema's figurations, technologies, and practices reveal their rich intermedial connections, producing corporeal, gestural, visceral histories. Relating film to other corporeal practices folds issues of social history, aesthetics, and the place of the cinema in the social. Cinema becomes a part of a larger complex of corporeal practices, and the dancing women that populate this book foreground the labor, skill, and virtuosity of the many on and off screen bodies that produce the processes and the pleasures of popular Hindi cinema. I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing screen. And we'll see um, if we'd like to discuss some of this.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful lecture. All the videos were so, engaging, so interesting. I was just into those. And interestingly, there was the song that you mentioned that was the first song of Wahida Rahman that was also copied by H.D. Burman in Bombay Ka Babu that came in 1950s, I think. And the Hindi version was Dekhne mein bhola hai, dil ka
Yes.
salona, Bombay se aaya hai, Babu Chinnanna. And
Yeah.
in that song, there's the beauty of Bengal, Suchitra Sen, who acted, and there's Devanand. So that is one thing. And
And she
so,
said the music composer called her and asked her to hum the tune of the Telugu song that they could
yeah,
then recreate.
yeah. And so why did you decide to work upon this theme? Because this is a very narrow street as of now. Nobody has worked upon the dancing women's. They were quote unquote invisible in the male gaze, as you can say. So why did you decide to work on this book?
Um, One is within film studies. Indian film studies is a very rich field with a lot of books written on popular cinema already. What was missing was really a book on dance in particular. There are fantastic books, Sangeeta Gopal and Sujata Murthy's book called Global Bollywood, which is on a set of, it's an edited volume, a set of essays on music and dance. There are a number of other volumes on just on mainly on the song and dance sequence as a combined entity. But I thought working on dance will kind of illuminate other questions around gender, as I hope the presentation kind of reveals. This isn't just a discussion of who is on screen, what are these narratives about, is it a kind of taming of the shrew narrative, but rather it's actually what's happening behind the scenes. So it's also a different way of thinking about cinema. Cinema not just as the story that we receive. Many of us might never remember the what happens in a film, but what we remember is one particular favorite song sequence or dance number from it, right? So it's also a question of our own cultural memory of cinema. So by thinking about the dancing woman, it was forcing me to think about these various things. It was forcing me to think about labor. It was forcing me to think about gender and sexuality, and then our own spectatorial memory of films. So it kind of helps you. It helps you think centrally about how movement is produced on film. The number of erased bodies that are also at work in producing this.
One thing that came up in the presentation itself was that sometimes these dance forms, these dance numbers question the social notions of the time, like that you mentioned Vajantimala's dance in Katputli.
Mhm.
So how do you see that? Were these dances questioning the social notions of that time?
They're always walking the tightrope of because there is censorship, there is the industrial commercial kind of imperative to make money at the box office. So they're walking a tightrope, but it is in that negotiation that really interesting things happen. So it's not as if the Katputli climax dance number is necessarily scandalous. It's not, it's not Choli ke piche kya hai, which does set off censorship battles, and which I write about in one of the chapters in the film. But there are other things that are constantly pushing the envelope in terms of women's participation in the film. So in Katputli, you have another dancer, Kamla Lakshman, who's a very famed Bharatanatyam dancer from the South, who performs what would then be considered sort of like an item number. She has no other role in the film. She just appears for this scintillating, really speedy Bharatanatyam mudra kind of combination. So we're also, when we read these song and dance sequences historically, we're reading them in their time. The film definitely is pushing at what is permissible. There is a very kind of confusing romantic number between her and the director, played by Balraj Sahni, when she's already kind of committed to this other man who will be her husband. And the film doesn't explain why there is that romantic number. So you're left confused. Is it a traditional triangle or is it not? And yet the film doesn't care about those things. It cares really about staging one spectacular dance number after another. So that itself is is a kind of counter to what is expected in the social narrative of domesticity, of women's place inside the house, of unmoving bodies, right? Of narratives where that end with marriage. Whereas Kathputli, the marriage happens somewhere in the middle of the film. It's hardly consequential, but she goes on performing. She becomes a mother, but the real heart of the narrative is her stardom. And her life as a working woman. So that is really what I find interesting. I call them melodramas of dance reform in the book. These are films that attempt to make the dancing woman stop dancing and bring her into the realm of the good wife, of the Devi, not the Bai. Um, and some of these films just refuse to do that. In Guide and Tisri Kasam, Vaida Rahman's protagonists that she plays refuse to give up their careers as dancers. And so the men in Tisri Kasam, the third promise that Raj Kapoor's character makes is to never fall in love with a woman who works in the Nautanki ever again, because she's ambitious. She says, I might become the Devi of your house, but then maybe no one will ever look at me again. And am I willing to give up that public gaze of adoration upon me? So these are women within the films and as actresses with great agency. They are defining how their talents are to be used and showcased. Right? We have these traditional narratives about exploitation, about them being just passive objects of the male gaze, but closely watching the dancing actually dispels those easy kinds of formulations.
So, taking from a question, you said that sometimes these are made for the blockbuster hits, and generally we see that time, the population, those who we went and watched the movies were mainly male. So do you think these were majorly made for the male gaze? Like you mentioned Nautanki, there are many instances of Nautankis in these movies. Like there's a song in Naya Daur, Reshmi Salwar Kurta Jali Ka. These kind of things. There are many more. So do you think these were made for the male gaze? And even the song Choli ke piche kya hai? So what do you think? Do you agree?
The films were actually being watched by a wide variety of audiences. It wasn't only the balcony was always called the family kind of area, not just, so the stalls were kind of considered the space for often for male working class spectators, but not necessarily. We know there were working class women also as part of that audience. But one of the big questions about spectatorial pleasure was to ask, where does my own feminist pleasure lie in these dance numbers? Why do I love Choli Ke Piche Kya Hai? Why do I love so many item dances? And it is because they're doing complex work. They're not only, it is not as if they are not addressed to the male gaze. Vaida Rahman says, they would make the projectionist replay just that dance number, which is, we know they want the dance number to be so successful that people will throw coins at the screen, will whistle and dance in the aisles alongside, etc. So there are all of those commercial needs and logics, which also I think are very important. We kind of flatten them if we think about them merely as exploitative, because they are what produce some of the particular specific joys of Indian popular cinema, right? Suddenly people breaking into this big song and dance number, or Salman Khan has to do one big number right at the start of his films because they are Eid releases. So they actually help release something, a kind of profusion of public joy in, through these dance numbers. And so I think I also write about male dancers in a separate article and some other articles. Amitabh Bachchan is dancing, is doing these solo numbers, Mere Angne Mein Tumhara Kya Kaam Hai. People are dancing along with that as well. And so we disrupt the sense that these dance numbers are being produced only for the male gaze. And in fact, it's a whole set of gazes in the audience. There are people who want to be that person on screen. There are men who want to dance and who do dance like the women, which is why TikTok videos I think are really great, because you'll have, a young boy in a rural Pakistan, for example, who's perfectly mimicking Madhuri Dixit's jhatkas and matkas. So he wants to be Madhuri Dixit. He's not kind of looking upon her with the male gaze. So there's a queering of this whole kind of um, terrain of who is looking and what kinds of desires are circulating.
Yeah, so you mentioned Amitabh Bachchan, and as a Bollywood quizzer, this brings me to a trivia for many that the first movie that he did as a villain, Parwana, the choreographer of that movie asked the producer to remove him from the cast because he was a bad dancer. So that is one trivia for everybody. There's a question from G. Krishnan, and he says the question relates to my earlier question. The late Raj Kapoor said anything that is not erotic is dead. Would you say that the dances in Hindi films have been oriented toward eroticism with an eye on box office success?
Like I said, I mean, there is some of that. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Where does this kind of respectability discourse come from? Is something that the book is constantly asking, and it's kind of tracing it from the 1930s. Um, we kind of, because we've been given this narrative of classical dance, which is kind of denuded of shringara, of its erotic elements, and is kind of cleansed into this bhakti kind of expression of bhakti, we kind of think of film dance. And I outline in the introduction, for example, responses to film dance in the 40s and 50s. A lot of cultural reformers are up in arms against film dance, that it is corrupted, it is erotic, it's spoiling the audiences, the working class audience that can't make up its own mind. These are just these kind of elitist presumptions about how these dances work. The fact is, there is a lot of extensive performance, similar kinds of performance before the cinema, in Parsi theater, in Nautanki, Jatra. The Devdasi and Tavayev performances were all kind of circulating. Eroticism was part of that expressive mode. It wasn't seen as something to be denigrated and disparaged. And so the production of the cleansed heroine is a kind of 1940s, 50s production. The films have to struggle very hard to kind of produce this, Sati Savitri kind of pure and virtuous heroine who often doesn't dance, who just sits there and watches the vamp dance. So you have to place that eroticism onto an other body, an outsider body. Helen's mixed race body is perfect for that, in fact. But then every film had to have a Helen dance number. So, clearly there were demands from distributors that every film in the 60s and the 70s had to feature a cabaret. And these are pleasures that are part of our own desires of the cinema. So I take a more kind of um, an approach that is interested in seeing where these attacks are coming from. The Madhuri Dixit, when I interviewed her, for example, said Choli Ke Piche Kya Hai is her favorite dance number because it was such a difficult dance number for her and Saroj Khan to choreograph. And she has a step where she's twirling her ankle in her ghagra. And she said to do that took so much time, but she's so proud of that performance. So when we move beyond that question of just whether something is lascivious or scintillating, we actually think about training, and we think about the pleasure that the performers take in these dances.
So we'll take two more questions before we end the session. This is from Harshvardhan Eluri, and his question is from the classical dance of early times to the swag of rap dancing of contemporary popular cinema. How does it influence the people across spaces and classes? Does it have the same effect on all, or people receive it in different ways?
That's a really interesting question, and it's hard, but doing empirical studies of actual viewers is very difficult. So it's not kind of a data driven kind of reception analysis, but it's more a sense of what kinds of people are interested. The question of classical dance and its impact on viewers was something that was hectically discussed in the Sangeet Natak Academy seminars of the 1950s, early 1950s. So a lot of people, Durga Khote and Devika Rani and Uday Shankar are all having hectic arguments in these Sangeet Natak Academy seminars, where some of them say film dance is corrupting classical dance, and so people are learning the wrong moves, whereas others say, Durga Khote, for example, says the reason so many people are flocking to classical dance classes is because of film dance, because cinema is kind of showcasing classical dance. So it's a constant tussle about, and many dance scholars will say there isn't a certain authentic classical dance in any case. It was something that was appropriated from hereditary performers. It was completely changed and altered, and it was, given the stamp of the state approval, as well as this kind of Sanskritized tradition that this particular dance form draws from the Natya Shastra, therefore it has the stamp of classicism. So Odissi has to struggle very hard to be canonized as a classical dance form, what we now take for granted, right? So it's an arbitrary kind of canonizing of particular forms. That produces the classical. So we should be very suspicious of this category of the classical. It's not a fixed category. It's something that is artificially produced, and it's constantly changing. And I think there's a lot of pushback on that category once again in terms of questions of caste. Right. So this kind of appropriation of classical performance cultures, dance, music, etc., by dominant caste performers, and the erasure of oppressed caste performers is something that's back in public conversation. And I think it's really important. And I'm hoping that this is part of that conversation. Rap and other forms are really, it's interesting. Tamil cinema for me is really interesting because Kuthu is, such a big part, just like the Salman Khan dance number in his Eid releases. Kuthu dance, which is taken from Terukuthu, it's, a popular folk form, often a Dalit folk form. It kind of finds place in Tamil popular cinema. That's because Tamil popular cinema comes from a very different history of Dravidian politics as well, right? So that popular cinema has a very different place in the caste politics of reception there. I think Hindi cinema is working differently and is getting pulled in these directions of wanting to be bourgeois in the 1940s. It has to appeal to a more respectable audience. So yes, a short answer would be there's a whole range of performances. What I do like about these TV dance shows, for example, is they break down these barriers. So the same person will do a kind of mashup of different kinds of forms.
So the last question for today is from Anubha Kakru, and her question is: looking at Azuri Siloy from Chandrasena, I am reminded of Uday Shankar's Kalpana. What was the influence of that experimental film and Uday Shankar on the song and dance sequences of Indian cinema?
That is great. And Kalpana is a very important film. It's from 1948. Chandrasena is from 1935. So Chandrasena actually precedes it quite a bit. But Uday Shankar is performing on stage in India, in different parts of India, in the 30s as well. So it's very possible that already that idiom is circulating. But there are many other performers, Oriental dance performers, who are also performing. And so the 30s are a really interesting transnational moment. We think of the 90s onwards as this moment of globalization, but there is, historically, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in the 30s. There are many performers passing through India, and La Mary, Ragini Devi, Ruth St. Denis performs. Ruth St. Denis, and Anna Pavlova is the one who convinces Uday Shankar to dance with her in Paris. And that is how his idiom of modern Indian dance is actually kind of invented. He goes to Ajanta and Ellora and looks at sculptures and paintings and produces something that is modeled as the classical. But V. Shantaram is also bringing other idioms of Lavani, Tamasha, um, and is very interested in the spectacle of the woman. Even his studio's kind of icon is this kind of silhouette of a woman with a pungi, with a trumpet, right? So all of those figurations are very much at work in Azuri's dancing. And I often present separately on Azuri because I think she's absolutely fascinating. She's Jewish, Hindu, German, Indian, grows up in Bangalore, then moves to Bombay, but she then moves to Pakistan after partition. So she is learning these various forms from watching films, and she performs in Bengali films, in Bombay films, etc. So she is an interesting figure, and we see these the influence of Kalpana, just to kind of close off on that response, it had a deep influence on S.S. Vasan, who makes Chandralekha, a very important Tamil film, because Kalpana is shot in Madras, in a Madras studio. And so Chandralekha, that influences Chandralekha, which in turn kind of produces this masala, formula of throwing in everything, sword fights and kidnappings and major, the drum dance of Kalpana, of Chandralekha is very famous. So these films are in conversation with each other. They actually completely blur these categories of experimental art cinema, popular cinema, etc., right? Because it's an industrial logic that is common to all of them.
And I think Uday Shankar's contribution to Indian cinema is also like Zohra Sehgal and Guru Dutt. So the many don't know that Guru Dutt was also a classical trained dancer who later turned into an actor. Thank you so much, ma'am, for doing this session. It was truly an interesting, delightful session for me and for many those who are watching us live and those who will be watching us on YouTube in a while. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you again with your new book that you are currently working on. Can you tell us about your current project that you are working on?
Sure. It's very early days, but I'm kind of exploring the distribution and reception of Indian cinema in the Caribbean. I taught for a year at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad, and I have been obsessed with the Caribbean ever since. The Caribbean has a significant percentage of Indo-Caribbean people who went as indentured labor. But that has produced then a very rich cultural kind of world of fusion musical forms, of interactions between Afro and Indo-Caribbean people. And I'm interested, and many of them grew up watching Indian films, whether you were of African or Indian origin. So I'm interested once again in this question of cultural memory. How does cinema help kind of create a cultural memory? How might that actually help heal differences along racial lines, religious lines, which are all kind of coming up in the Caribbean as well? And I'm equally interested in the influence of Caribbean forms on Indian cinema very broadly. So I didn't know until I went to teach there that Om Shanti Om, the song from Kars, which is again recreated in Om Shanti Om, the film, 2007 film, is actually an original Trinidadian soca song from 1974 or 77. And if you go to YouTube, you will find it. It's by Lord Shorty. So I want to find out how these musical forms were traveling across the oceanic kind of routes of cinematic exchange.
Wow. And Karwan would recommend this book, Dancing Women. Please go check that book out. It is on Amazon right now. It's available on Kindle, and the I think the paperback is around 2,000 rupees. Soon an Indian version will be out. We request the OUP, if you are watching us, please do that ASAP so that we can enjoy that book. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a great event, and have a great evening.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so much,
much.
everybody who watched us live. Have a great day.